Welcome back to the Property Buyble. My name is Kim Ackerman. I'm a buyer's agent from Sydney. Now, we're in our investor series now, which means all things investment property, portfolios, and everything in between. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic called the land to asset ratio, or the land to building ratio. Now, this is something I feel like is not really discussed, especially by a lot of entry-level investors. So I have someone very established in his field to talk about this topic today. I have Mr. Mike Mortlock. Mike, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Kim. It's a pleasure.
You're welcome. Now, everybody, Mike is a quantity surveyor. You're a managing director of MCG Quantity Surveyors. You have done thousands of depreciation reports.
That's true.
And, you know, you've got 20 plus years in the industry, represent a lot of big firms, and you have your own podcast called Geared for Growth.
Yes. Yeah,
so
that's right.
Anyone listening, have a listen to that. It's fantastic. And you're going to learn a lot of really valuable information from Mike. But look, today we're here to talk about this land to asset ratio. I really find a lot of new investors that I speak to kind of like deer in headlights when you start saying those words.
Yeah.
And the whole point of this topic is to really go through what is it and why is it important for investors that are building their portfolios. So can you please give the listeners an understanding of what does that mean?
Yeah.
And explain it in a bit more layman's terms for people.
Yeah, what it really means is your asset is the whole purchase price of the investment property, right? So if you're spending $1 million on an investment property and you know that the land component on its own is worth, say, 700, then you would have a 70% land to asset ratio. Now, why is that important? Well, there is some evidence to say that there's a correlation between capital growth and properties that have a higher land to asset ratio. So let's say 50, 70%, something like that. And I think from an investor that's just maybe starting out, or like you say, a bit of a deer in the headlights, it's a non-emotional metric that does have an influence on capital growth, right? So when I say non-emotional, it's something that you can look at a property and go, okay, the land to asset ratio is roughly X, right?
Yeah.
And it's just something that is, it's a tangible kind of metric that's going to plug into the success of the property, whereas emotional things like, oh yeah, that's somewhere I could live, or you know, it's got
the
a
lifestyle.
Or, I love the facade. You know, that doesn't actually really typically matter to the success of that property.
Right. So when we talk about the land to asset ratio, we're talking about the ratio of the land versus the asset or the building portion. And, you know, as we've spoken about before, that can be anywhere from 80-20, 60-40, depends where you're buying and the value of the land.
Yes.
One thing we spoke about recently, this is why people can buy, you know, multi-million-dollar derelict property in some parts of Sydney suburbs because the land is worth so much.
Yeah.
And the portion is majority made up of the land portion. Yeah. Really.
Well, typically the land asset ratio could be higher than 100% if you've got a dwelling that's adding no value. It's not tenantable. So it could actually just be a developer or an investor looking at it thinking, if I buy this, I've got to knock it down. It's actually going to cost me money. Yeah. So the land is you know, it's a huge component of that property. It's really all there is. Yeah.
And it's really just, I think, something for people to have in their back pocket and think about, especially when you're building a portfolio, you're going to want to diversify different types of property, and each of those properties are going to be on different ratios of land to asset. And I mean, from the asset side of things, that's where you come in as a quantity surveyor. So just so that people know, I mean, the land portion, as you mentioned, is predominantly for the capital growth value of the home or of the property. When we've got the asset portion, that's when you come in as a quantity surveyor because that's where you get your tax depreciation from.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm a construction cost estimating person. Yep. And people might say, look, I've spent $1 million on this investment property and we do a depreciation schedule, and we might say there's $650 $100,000 worth of total depreciation. They're like, whoa, I paid $1 million. Like, why is there such a gap?
Yeah.
The land component is it's non-depreciable, right? So it doesn't actually exist as a depreciating asset. And that sort of speaks to the old adage, right? Like land appreciates, building depreciates. That's really the whole reason why.
Yeah. And this is why it's just so important for people to be aware that this is even a thing. It's like an elephant in the room, or it's like a magical thing that it's not really tangible, as you said, but it's an element that people should take into consideration, because depending on what you're wanting to do with that property or how you want it to affect your portfolio is going to affect the type of ratio you should be buying into, in my opinion. Do you find that, some people that are wanting a larger asset to land ratio, for example, are those maybe wanting to minimize their tax position?
Yeah, that's the one advantage. So if you think about, say, a typical house as opposed to a townhouse, a house is going to have a bigger component of land value. And there's a fairly strong argument to say that there's going to be more of a capital growth driver. Whereas typically there's not going to be as much deductions in that house as there might be, say, a newer townhouse, for example, right? But then the land to asset ratio is smaller because the townhouse kind of dominates that block from a value point of view and even a footprint point of view. So you get better deductions on those, and typically you'll also get a better yield. So that's another thing to think about. The land to asset ratio is just kind of like a tool, right?
Yes.
And it's not an exact science, and it depends on your portfolio and where you're up to. Like you might be wanting to go a growth property because you've got your cash flow sorted. You've got some, cash flow positive properties. Or you might be going, I've got blue chip eastern suburbs Sydney with,
all negatively geared.
Yeah, bugger all yields, right? I need a cashy, right? So your land to asset ratio is probably going to be a little bit less. And you definitely can have capital growth and cash flow, but you can't specialize in one without differentiating the other, I believe, anyway.
And do you find that, because as we said, it's almost impossible to tell what that ratio is for a start. But if you were to be doing a depreciation report for an apartment versus a house, would you find typically the building portion or the structure portion of that apartment, even though it's one portion of an entire building, is generally a larger ratio to the land portion because land is being shared? Yeah,
absolutely. Because you think about, let's say, a high-rise block, it might be 2,000 square meters, right? But if it's got 200 apartments on it, which is possible, right? Like, because you're just going up, the land parcel doesn't really change. And then the more units you have in the complex, the more you're just cutting down your share of that lot. So you can typically say, I've got X amount of square meters that the common property area land parcel is, divide that by the number of units to work out kind of what your percentage ownership of that is. And then you need to know what the actual value of that land is. And that can be a challenge, especially in, say, here where we are in Sydney. How many vacant blocks come for sale? Very infrequent, right?
Yeah, and those are the ones that really give us the information and dictate what is exactly happening in the market. If you were selling a Paddington Terrace and you had a vacant block next door that sold for $2 million, there's a good chance that Paddington Terrace, if that's selling for $3 million, the land to asset ratio is, 66% or whatever, or wherever that kind of stands at that point. But it's often impossible. I think some suburbs are more obvious than others. As far as the land value, because you know that they're rich suburbs and they're very premium. So the lifestyle, as you mentioned earlier, is important because of the location for these things. But when we talk about this, there's two forms of land to asset ratio. We've got the monetary value form. And then a lot of people sometimes talk about the physical form, the square meters land to asset ratio, but we're very much talking about the value form.
I think that's the more useful metric, right? Like you can look at the footprint as a percentage of the total lot, but I think the value is probably the better metric to be looking at.
Do you ever, sometimes I go into the Valuer General New South Wales because they have very set values for land for these properties. Sometimes I use that as a rough estimating tool. Do you ever jump on there and have a bit of a squeeze and see where that stacks up? Obviously, they're not 100% accurate, their estimates for each of the years.
Yeah.
But do you ever use that as a guide?
Yeah, like with the Australian Institute of Quantity Surveyors, which is our governing body, they sort of spoke to us a few years ago and said that sort of top-down method of calculating depreciation is not appropriate. So purchase price minus land value should roughly equal what the building is. But
it's not the case.
Yeah, we don't really look at that
off.
anymore. Yeah. And we can actually prepare a depreciation schedule that has a higher total depreciation than the actual purchase price of the property, right? Let's say we go out for a drink after this, right, and we get on very well. This could go anywhere. Stick with me.
Where is this going?
And you decide that you want to sell me one of your properties at half price because I'm a nice guy, or I've fallen on hard times, or whatever reason.
Fire sale.
Yeah, I'm going to have to think of a better pitch because so far I think it's going to be market price. But it's not an arm's length transaction, right? So for us to say that the total depreciation has got to be less than the purchase price would be doing a disservice in that example.
Because it really is impossible to tell. I see properties sold all the time. I buy properties all the time, and they all get to different purchase prices for very different reasons. They're all affected by different things. There's no one way, like all of them go to auction, or all of them are private treaty, or all of them are off market. It's just not the case. And so you'll find that some fall below market value, some kind of fall in the range, and some go above.
And it depends on a lot of things, right? You might have missed out on 2 or 3 properties and you're thinking, I'm getting this next one. I don't care what. Like my parents have tapped me on the shoulder saying, go an extra 100,000, right? And then similar property round the corner with no different sort of attributes might go for 100 grand less just because you got the shits with missing out on property. And you're just like, I've got to secure it, right?
Exactly.
And it depends on how good the agent is marketing it. Is it an off market? Is it a pre-market? Are they incentivized to go for that extra 5%, or do they just want to get rid of it because the vendors are paying the backside? I mean, all these things happen, right? People kind of muddy the water, right? Because people don't act the perfect way that you would expect them to. Like paying an extra 100 grand for a property just because you've gotten annoyed. It's not like a computer wouldn't model that way. Absolutely, especially in the market we've had. But getting back to the valuer generals as a point, my sort of question to anybody is the valuer generals is really calculated for your land value, right? And you see, you'll get your rates notes, say your land value is X. My big question is, when you see that land value, would you be happy to sell your block of land for that amount?
This is the thing.
And the answer is almost going to it's going to be no, right?
Because the valuer general land value is not necessarily what it would go for on the market.
It's
at
not
this
a market
point in
value.
time. It's not. We all know it would go for more, whether or not there was a structure on there. In some cases, people prefer there's no structure on there, especially if they're wanting to build their own property. So there might be special value on that for some people. But this is not something we discussed, but I wanted to ask you, have you ever done an exercise where you've assessed the different suburbs, for example, in a particular region to see the rough value of the land versus the purchase prices and where the average is of the land to asset ratio?
I've never really done that as an exercise. Of course, we collect a lot of data on construction costs and the price people are paying for different properties. But because the land's a non-depreciable component, it's almost kind of like an afterthought to us. So we're not qualified to put a market value on something. We're just working out a construction value and then a depreciable value. It'd be a worthwhile exercise.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. I might get a few data people involved and do that exercise. Because
send Kent an email. He'll be.
I'll send Kent Lardo an email and see if he'd be interested. But he probably already tracks it for all we know. But it'd be a good exercise to do because I think you'd really start to see some trends of the asset value and the land value and how it's kind of skewed across the areas. Because just because you put $1 million into a property, it doesn't mean the ratio increses.
It depends on the area, right? And a property that's say sitting on 1,000 square metre parcel of land is not necessarily worth twice as much as a 500,000 square metre parcel, right? Sorry, a 500 square metre parcel.
That's it.
Because as it gets bigger, the cost per square metre for the land
economies of scale.
Yeah, exactly. And you think about a farmhouse on 50 acres, the land or asset value is like, it's all land, really.
I know.
But the house is the utility, right? So the land is not, you can't really rent it out. Like, not in the city. You can't sort of put goats on it and charge somebody. You can do that in the country.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe you can.
Maybe some parts of Western Sydney.
Check your local council.
Not in Surrey Hills, for example.
No, not in Surrey Hills. So you need that that dwelling there, because that's where the rental sort of value comes from. And hypothetically, you could buy a block of land and just land bank it, right?
Yeah.
It's something developers do. It's not necessarily something that, say, a first or a second investment property person does, because you've got to chip in. Got to
make an income as well.
Yeah, you've got to pay the interest off.
Yeah.
So unless you've got income to do that, it's going to be impossible.
I feel like if people are buying land, it's either, like you said, for the developer side of things, or people that just have very low risk profiles and don't want to take on the burden of having a tenant and everything in between, and maybe have a very high cash flow or already achieving good cash flow. They don't need to inject that in there.
It's nice work if you can get it. But for most people, you need the dwelling.
It's crazy to do that.
Yeah, but according to David Johnson, there's international research that says that about 80% of the capital growth component of an asset is in the land, which leaves only 20% for the dwelling. So that kind of goes to show why the land to asset ratio is an important one for an investor to understand.
It's really important. And one of the things, like, I was thinking about this the other day, if people are out there and they're looking at like flipping property, for example, and it obviously depends on so many factors. So this is all very general information. Everyone don't take any of this as Buyble and go and use it for anything. But if people are looking at flipping property and they're buying something at such a high ratio of land and only a very small component of the asset, you're only affecting that small component when you're trying to renovate a property and flip it. Yeah. So you don't have a lot of influence on the overall value. And that's why I always say to people, it is possible, but it's a lot more difficult to make money off flipping property in some of Sydney's,
established sort of suburbs.
Bondi, North Bondi, in the city, like some of these areas is so difficult.
Yeah.
You have to buy at a really good level, be really efficient with your money for the renovations, and then sell at a really good level. And even then, taking into consideration capital gains tax and everything else that you throw in there with the finances, it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
So that's another reason to really think about the importance, or just understand how the land to asset ratio works.
Yeah, if you want to flip, like in Sydney, for example, you might be looking at a terrace, right, which has got a tiny little courtyard if you're lucky. But, the dwelling has a big impact on the price. Yes. But flipping is kind of risky, right, because you've got that time horizon for the works to be carried out. Now, if you can do it over a fortnight or something, then great.
Yeah.
But you don't really know what the market's going to do necessarily over the 6 months. But if you can buy at the beginning of a fast appreciating market, then you can make money. But then you also look at construction costs. Like, who could have really foreseen that they would go up 20% in 12 months, right?
It's just wild. I mean, I was at a property last week with some clients with a builder of theirs, and he said he was giving us, like, rattling off different costs that have gone up as far as materials are concerned. Some materials have gone up fourfold.
Yeah.
And you just think, imagine what effect that has on quotes for renovations or extensions and things like that.
It's the backlog as well, right?
Yes.
So you
and the wait times.
Yeah. Like, if a builder doesn't need the work, then they might be quoting way above.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, if they agreed to do it for that, I'd do it, right? But otherwise, I'm busy for the next.
It's like off-market property in Sydney. They'll be like, yeah, you can sell it if you get that price. I'll sell it.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
But look, people are still renovating, which is great. A lot of them are renovating for their own homes, which is great.
Yeah.
But it's just something to consider that, you're only affecting a very small portion if you are buying into areas where the land is worth such a huge portion of that overall value. But follow your own path and what you need for your own portfolio, and your intention of what you want to do with that property can be very different from the next person. But I think before we wrap up today, we're going to give people some tips on what they can really take away from this episode. So I guess one of the first tips for everybody is that there is no magic formula for the land to asset ratio. I tried to get it out of Mike and I tried to ask him and he sort of said the same thing. There's no magic formula. Unfortunately, you can estimate based on purchase prices and value of general land values and everything like that. But overall, you start to see a trend in these properties, I think. The other thing is there's not just land value for houses, also for apartments.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Well.
You've just got a share of that common area.
Correct.
Yeah.
So you've got a lot. You might be sharing it with 10 apartments or 100 apartments. You're still sharing that lot and you still own a portion of that land. So there is still a land value and a land ratio for apartments as well. The other thing is just understand how this balance affects your portfolio. Speak to your buyer's agent or investment strategist or your accountant or anybody involved in this process to see how that next property is going to affect you and how the land to asset ratio is going to either be better or worse for your current situation. I guess the other thing is to really just understand that the land portion of this ratio is your capital growth driver.
Yes.
That's where you're going to get capital growth and the value and squeeze the value out of the capital growth. The asset portion you have a lot more influence on through renovations or improvements, and that's where you get your depreciation out of your tax benefits.
And I'm a depreciation guy, right?
You are.
But people say to me, which sort of property should I buy for the best deductions?
Yeah.
And I then normally go on to explain a property that sounds like a terrible investment for them, right? Because you get better deductions on brand new, on high-rise apartments because the cost per square metre is high. There might be 2 gyms and a cinema and 14 levels of car park.
Yeah.
You own a percentage of that, right? Your strata fees will make your hair go grey.
Yeah.
And you might buy it for $500,000 and it'd be worth $280 in 5 years' time, right? So it could be a terrible investment. So depreciation's a bonus. It shouldn't be a strategy.
I agree. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's a bonus. You have all these components that make up a good investment. You've got your capital growth, your strong yield, your low vacancy rates. There's a million different things you could look at. Probably capital growth and yield are the two dominant ones, I'd say. But that depreciation and those tax benefits, they're going to come from the asset portion of that ratio. Yeah. And as Mike said, they are a bonus item. I wouldn't use that and make it your priority and go out and look for investment properties, but take it into consideration when you're doing your cash flow and your calculations, because it's just something to think about and be aware of when we're building investment portfolios. So thank you, Mike.
Pleasure.
Loved having that chat. You're a natural at this, obviously, having a
Thank
podcast
you.
of your own. But I really appreciate your time and your knowledge, and we could do a whole nother thing on depreciation reports alone and everything in between. But I think this is just a nice to have for people to just be aware of going forward. And thanks for coming along.
Thank you. Thanks for selling me one of your properties at half price. I really appreciate that.
We'll talk about that later. But thanks everyone for listening. Hopefully you've learned something today, and we've got some good episodes coming up soon for the investor edition. So tune in and we'll see you soon.